Hi, everybody. All right, so this is going to be our read aloud for part 2 of the Metamorphosis. And I just want to remind you before we start that we're not going to read all the way through part 2 together in this video. I'm only going to do the part that applies to your turn and talk questions. So your homework is going to be to finish part 2. And like you found with part 1, if you don't finish it and do that homework on your own, you're going to find the next couple of days of class difficult until you do. Okay? So with that, let's go to our text. All right. So I'm going to switch back and forth through the windows so that we can see the questions, and I'll cue you and you can pause the video and answer the questions if you want to do that. If you'd rather wait for everything at the end, you can do that too. You don't have to pause the video. I'll just keep right on going. Okay. All right. So part 2. It was not until it was getting dark that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyway, even if he hadn't been disturbed, as he'd had enough sleep and felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading to the front room being carefully shut had awoken him. The light from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and the tops of the furniture, but down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antenna, of which he was now beginning to learn the value, in order to see what had happened there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of that morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been, and it dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he reached the door that he realized what it actually was that had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door there was a dish filled with sweetened milk with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he'd been that morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat if his whole body worked together as a snuffling whole. But the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. But he turned, almost against his own will, away from the dish and crawled back into the center of the room. Through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at this time would normally be sat with his evening paper, reading it in a loud voice to Gregor's mother and sometimes his sister, but there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about this reading, but maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around, too, that even though there must have been somebody in the flat. What a quiet life it is the family lead, Gregor said to himself, and gazing into the darkness, felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. But what now if all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a horrible and frightening end? That was something Gregor didn't want to think about too much, so he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. Once, during that long evening, the door on one side of the room was opened very slightly and hurriedly closed again. Later on, the door on the other side did the same. It seemed that someone needed to enter the room, but thought better of it. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved to either bring the timorous visitor into the room in some way, or at least to find out who it was. But the door opened no more that night, and Gregor waited in vain. The previous morning, while all the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to get in there to him, but now that he'd opened up one of his doors and the others had clearly been unlocked sometime during the day, no one came, and the keys were in the other sides. It was not until late at night that the gaslight in the living room was put out, and now it was easy to see that his parents and sister had stayed awake all that time, as they all could be distinctly heard as they went away together on tiptoe. It was clear that no one would come into Gregor's room any more until morning. That gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. For some reason, the tall, empty room where he'd been forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay there flat on the floor, even though he'd been living in it for 5 years. Hardly aware of what he was doing other than a slight feeling of shame, he hurried under the couch. It pressed down on his back a little, and he was no longer able to lift his head, but he nonetheless felt immediately at ease, and his only regret was that his body was too broad to get under it all underneath. All right, so we're going to pause there, and if you want to answer your first question here, you can. So our first question is, why won't anyone come into Gregor's room? And what makes you say that? So it's possible there are a few different answers here. So again, why won't anyone come into Gregor's room? And what makes you say that? If you're going to answer the question now, go ahead and pause the video. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. So Gregor is under the couch. He spent the whole night there. Some of the time he passed in a light sleep, although he frequently awoke from it in alarm because of his hunger, and some of the time was spent in worries and vague hopes, which, however, always led to the same conclusion. For the time being, he must remain calm. He must show patience and the greatest consideration so that his family could bear the unpleasantness that he, in his present condition, was forced to impose upon them. Gregor soon had the opportunity to test the strength of his decisions, as early the next morning, almost before the night had ended, his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the front room and looked anxiously in. She did not see him straight away, but when she did notice him under the couch, he had to be somewhere, for God's sake, he couldn't have flown away, she was so shocked that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again from the outside. But she seemed to regret her behavior as she opened the door again straight away and came in on tiptoe, as if entering the room of someone seriously ill or even of a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward right to the edge of the couch and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk as it was, realize that it was not from lack of hunger, and bring him some other food that was more suitable? If she didn't do it herself, he would rather go hungry than draw her attention to it, although he did feel a terrible urge to rush forward from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. However, his sister noticed the full dish immediately and looked at it, and at the few drops of milk splashed around it with some surprise. She immediately picked it up, using a rag, not her bare hands, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious as to what she would bring in its place, imagining the wildest possibilities, but he never could have guessed what his sister, in her goodness, actually did bring. In order to test his taste, she brought him a whole selection of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal covered in a white sauce that had gone hard, a few raisins and almonds, some cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry roll, and some bread with butter and salt. As well as all that, she poured some water into the dish, which had probably been permanently set aside for Gregor's use, and placed it beside them. And then, out of consideration for Gregor's feelings, as she knew he would not eat in front of her, she hurried out again and even turned the key in the lock so Gregor would know he could make things as comfortable for himself as he liked. Gregor's little legs whirred. At last, he could eat. What's more, his injuries must have already completely healed, as he found no difficulty in moving. This amazed him, as more than a month earlier he'd cut his finger slightly with a knife, and he thought of how his finger had still hurt the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive than I used to be then? He thought, and was already suckling greedily at the cheese, which had immediately, almost compellingly, attracted him much more than the other foods on the newspaper. Quickly, one after another, his eyes watering with pleasure, he consumed the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, he didn't like at all, and even dragged the things he did not want to eat a little way away from it, because he couldn't stand the smell. Long after he'd finished eating and lay lethargic in the same place, his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a sign to him that he should withdraw. He was immediately startled, although he'd been half asleep, and he hurried back under the couch. But he needed great self-control to stay there, even for the short time his sister was in the room, as eating so much food had rounded out his body a little, and he could hardly breathe in the narrow space. Half suffocating, he watched with bulging eyes as his sister unselfconsciously took a broom and swept up the leftovers, mixing them with all the food he'd not even touched at all, as if it could not be used any more. She quickly dropped it all in a bin, closed it with its wooden lid, and carried everything out. She had hardly turned her back before Gregor came out again from under the couch and stretched himself. This was how Gregor received his food every day now, once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten their meal at midday, as his parents would sleep for a while then as well, and Gregor's sister would send the maid away on some errand. Gregor's father and mother certainly did not want him to starve either, but perhaps it would have been more than they could stand to have any more experience of his feeding than being told about it. And perhaps his sister wanted to spare them what distress she could, as if they were indeed suffering enough. It was impossible for Gregor to find out what they had told the doctor and the locksmith that first morning to get them out of the flat. As nobody could understand him, nobody, not even his sister, thought that he could understand them. So he had to be content to hear his sister's sighs and appeals to the saints as she moved about his room. It was only later, when she'd become a little more used to everything, though there was, of course, no question of her ever becoming fully used to the situation, Gregor would sometimes catch a friendly comment, or at least a comment that could be construed as friendly. "He enjoyed his dinner today," she might say when he diligently cleared away all the food left for him. Or if he left most of it, which slowly became more and more frequent, she would often say sadly, "Now everything's just been left there again." Although Gregor wasn't able to hear any news directly, he did listen to much of what was said in the next rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would scurry straight to the appropriate door and press his whole body against it. There was seldom any conversation, especially at first, that was not about him in some way, even if only in secret. For 2 whole days, all the talk at every meal was about what they should do now, but even between meals they spoke about the same subject, as there were always at least 2 members of the family at home. Nobody wanted to be home by themselves, and it was out of the question to leave the flat empty. And on the very first day, the maid had fallen to her knees and begged Gregor's mother to let her go without delay. It's not very clear how much she knew of what happened, but she left within a quarter of an hour, tearfully thanking Gregor's mother for her dismissal, as if she'd done her an enormous service. She even swore emphatically not to tell anyone in the slightest what had happened, though no one asked that of her. Okay, so we're going to pause here for our second question, if you're wanting to do that. So our second question is, what do you think this experience is like for Gregor's family, and what makes you say that? So what I'm really wondering is, how do you think they feel about all of this? Are they scared? Are they nervous? And how do you know? Okay, if you're going to answer the question now, go ahead and pause the video. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. Now Gregor's sister also had to help his mother with the cooking, although she could not so much bother as no one ate very much. Gregor often heard how one of them would unsuccessfully urge another to eat and received no more answer than, "No thanks, I've had enough," or something similar. No one drank very much either. His sister would sometimes ask his father whether he would like a beer, hoping for the chance to go and fetch it herself. When his father then said nothing, she would add, so that he would not feel selfish, that she could send the housekeeper for it, but then his father would close the matter with a big loud "no," and no more would be said. Even before the first day had come to an end, his father had explained to Gregor's mother and sister what their finances and prospects were, and now and then he stood up from the table and took some receipt or document from the little cash box he saved from his business when it collapsed 5 years earlier. Gregor heard how he opened the complicated lock and then closed it again after he had taken the item he wanted. When he heard his father say was some of the first good news that Gregor had heard since he'd first been incarcerated in his room. He thought that nothing at all remained of his father's business. At least, he never told him anything different, and Gregor never asked him about it anyway. Their business misfortune had reduced the family to a state of total despair, and Gregor's only concern at the time had been to arrange things so they could all forget as quickly as possible. So then he started working especially hard with a fiery vigor that raised him from a junior salesman to a traveling representative almost overnight, bringing with it the chance to earn money in quite different ways. Gregor converted his success at work straight into cash that he could lay on the table at home for the benefit of his astonished and delighted family. They'd been good times, and they had never come again, at least not with the same splendor, even though Gregor had later earned so much that he was in a position to bear the costs of the whole family. And he did bear them. They even got used to it, both Gregor and the family. They took the money with gratitude, and he was glad to provide it, although there was no longer much warm affection given in return. Gregor remained close to his sister now. Unlike him, she was fond of music and a gifted and expressive violinist. It was his secret plan to send her to the conservatory next year, even though it would cause great expense that would have to be made up for some other way. During Gregor's short periods in town, conversation with his sister would often turn to the conservatory, but it was only ever mentioned as a lovely dream that could never be realized. Their parents didn't like to hear this innocent talk, but Gregor thought about it quite hard and decided that he would let them know that he planned a great announcement of it on Christmas Day. That was the sort of totally pointless thing that went through his mind in his present state, pressed upright against the door and listening. There were times when he simply became too tired to continue listening, when his head would fall wearily against the door and he would pull it up again with a start, even as the slightest noise he caused could be heard next door, and they would all go silent. "What's he doing now?" his father would say after a while, clearly having gone over to the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation slowly be taken up again. When explaining these things, his father repeated himself several times, partly because it was a long time since he'd been occupied with these matters himself, and partly because Gregor's mother did not understand everything the first time. From these repeated explanations, Gregor learned, to his pleasure, that despite their misfortunes, there was still some money available from the old days. It was not a lot, but it had not been touched in the meantime, and some interest had accumulated. Besides that, they'd not been using up all the money that Gregor had been bringing home every month, keeping only a little for himself, and so that too had been accumulating. Behind the door, Gregor nodded with enthusiasm in his pleasure at this unexpected thrift and caution. He could actually have used the surplus money to reduce his father's debt to his boss, and the day when he could have freed himself from that job would have come much closer. But now it was certainly better the way his father had done things. This money, however, was certainly not enough to enable the family to live off the interest. It was enough to maintain them, perhaps, for 1 or 2 years, no more. That's to say, the money should not really be touched but set aside, money that to live on had to be earned. His father was healthy but old, lacking in self-confidence. During the 5 years that he'd not been working, the first holiday in a life that had been full of strain and no success, he'd put on a lot of weight and become very slow and clumsy. Would Gregor's elderly mother now have to go earn money? She suffered from asthma, and it was a strain for her just to move about the home. Every other day would be spent struggling for breath on the sofa by the open window. Would his sister have to go earn money? She was still a child of 17. Her life up until then had been very enviable, consisting of wearing nice clothes, sleeping late, helping out the business, joining in with a few modest pleasures, and most of all playing the violin. Whenever they began to talk of the need to earn money, Gregor always first let go of the door and then throw himself onto the cool leather sofa next to it, as he became quite hot with shame and regret. He would often lie there the whole night through, not sleeping a wink, but scratching at the leather for hours on end. Or he might go to all the effort of pushing a chair to the window, climbing up on the sill and propped up on the chair, leaning on the window to stare out of it. He had used to feel a great sense of freedom from doing this, but doing it now was obviously something more remembered than experienced. What he actually saw in this way was becoming less distinct every day, even the things that were quite near. He had used to curse the ever-present view of the hospital across the street, but now he could not see it at all. and if he had not known that he lived in Charlottenstrasse, which was a quiet street despite being in the middle of the city, he would have thought he was looking out the window at a barren waste where the gray sky and the gray earth mingled inseparably. His observant sister only needed to notice the chair twice before she would always push it back into its exact position by the window after she tidied up the room, and even left the inner pane of the window open from then on. If Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all that she had to do for him, it would have been easier for him to bear it. But as it was, it caused him pain. His sister naturally tried as far as possible to pretend that there was nothing burdensome about it, and the longer it went on, of course, the better she was able to do so. But as time went by, Gregor was also able to see through it all so much better. It had even become very unpleasant for him now whenever she entered the room. No sooner had she come in than she would quickly close the door as a precaution so that no one would have to suffer the view into Gregor's room, and then she would go straight to the window and pull it hurriedly open, almost as if she were suffocating. Even if it was cold, she would stay at the window breathing deeply for a little while. She would alarm Gregor twice a day with this running about and noise making. He would stay under the couch shivering the whole while, knowing full well that she would certainly have liked to spare him this ideal, but it was impossible for her to be in the same room with him with the windows closed. Okay, so we're going to pause there for our third question. And again, if you're not doing the questions right now, you don't have to pause the video, but if you are, we're going to read the question and then we're going to pause. So our third question is, think about what you know about the family. So we know that Gregor earned all their money and they have enough to live on for 1 or 2 years. So keeping that in mind, why do you think Gregor wants to thank his sister for taking care of him? So there are multiple reasons here, and you want to kind of dig a little deeper beyond the obvious fact that he's transformed, right? That's definitely part of it, but you want to try to get a little more specific and in depth if you can. If you're answering the question now, go ahead and pause the video. All right, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. We're almost done. One day, about a month after Gregor's transformation, when his sister no longer had any particular reason to be shocked at his appearance, she came in the room a little earlier than usual and found him still staring out the window, motionless, and just where he would be the most horrible. In itself, his sister's not coming into the room would have been no surprise for Gregor, as it would have been difficult for her to immediately open the window while he was still there. But not only did she not come in, she went straight back and closed the door behind her. A stranger would have thought he'd threatened her and tried to bite her. Gregor went straight to hide himself under the couch, of course, but he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. It made him realize that she still found his appearance unbearable and would continue to do so. She probably even had to overcome the urge to flee when she saw the little bit of him that protruded from under the couch. One day, in order to spare her even this sight, he spent 4 hours carrying the bedsheet over to the couch on his back and arranged it so that he was completely covered and his sister would not be able to see him even if she bent down. If she did not think that this sheet was necessary, then all she had to do was take it off again, as it was clear enough that it was no pleasure for Gregor to cut himself off so completely. She left the sheet where it was. Gregor even thought he glimpsed a look of gratitude one time when he carefully looked out from under the sheet to see how his sister liked the new arrangement. For the first 14 days, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to come into the room to see him. He would often hear them say how they appreciated all the new work his sister was doing, even though before they had seen her as a girl who was somewhat useless and frequently been annoyed with her. But now the two of them, his father and mother, would often both wait outside the door of Gregor's room while his sister tidied up in there, and as soon as she went out again, she would have to tell them exactly how everything looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he'd behaved this time, and whether, perhaps, any slight improvement could be seen. His mother also wanted to go in and visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister at first persuaded her against it. Gregor listened very closely to all of this and approved fully. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, which made her call out, Let me go see Gregor. He's my unfortunate son. Can't you understand I have to see him? And Gregor would think to himself that maybe it would be better if his mother came in. Not every day, of course, but one day per week, perhaps. She could understand everything much better than his sister, who, for all her courage, was still just a child after all, and really might not have an adult's appreciation of the burdensome job she'd taken on. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon realized. Out of consideration for his parents, Gregor wanted to avoid being seen at the window during the day. The few square meters of floor did not give him much room to crawl about. It was hard to just lie quietly through the night. His food soon stopped giving him any pleasure at all, and so, to entertain himself, he got into the habit of crawling up and down the walls and ceiling. He was especially fond of hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the floor. He could breathe more freely, his body had a light swing to it, and up there, relaxed and almost happy, it might happen that he would surprise himself by letting go of the ceiling and landing on the floor with a crash. But now, of course, he had far better control of his body than before, and even with a fall as great as that, caused himself no damage. Very soon, his sister noticed Gregor's new way of entertaining himself. He had, after all, left traces of the adhesive from his feet as he crawled about, and she got it into her head to make it as easy as possible for him by removing the furniture that got in his way, especially the chest of drawers and a desk. Now, this was not something she'd be able to do by herself. She did not dare ask for help from her father. The 16-year-old maid had carried on bravely since the cook left, but she certainly would not have helped in this. She had even asked to be allowed to keep the kitchen locked at all times and never have to open the door unless it was especially important. So, his sister had no choice but to choose some time when Gregor's father was not there and fetch her mother to help her. As she approached the room, Gregor could hear his mother express her joy, but once at the door, she went silent. First, of course, his sister came in and looked around to see that everything in the room was all right, and only then did she let her mother enter. Gregor had hurriedly pulled the sheet down lower over the couch and put more folds in it so that everything really looked as if it had just been thrown down by chance. Gregor also refrained this time from spying out from under the sheet. He gave up the chance to see his mother until later and was simply glad that she had come in. "You can come in, he can't be seen," said his sister, obviously leading her by the hand. The old chest of drawers was too heavy for a pair of feeble women to be heaving about, but Gregor listened as they pushed it from its place, his sister always taking on the heaviest part of the work for herself, and ignoring his mother's warnings that she'd strain herself. This lasted a very long time. After laboring at it for 15 minutes or more, his mother said it would be better to leave the chest where it was. For one thing, it was too heavy for them to get the job finished before Gregor's father came home, and leaving it in the middle of the room would be in his way even more. And another thing, it wasn't even sure that taking the furniture away would really be of any help to him. She thought just the opposite. The sight of the bare walls saddened her right to her heart. And why wouldn't Gregor feel the same way about it? He'd been used to this furniture in his room for quite a long time, and it would make him feel abandoned to have an empty room like that. And then, quietly, almost whispering as if wanting Gregor, whose whereabouts she did not know, to hear not even the tone of her voice, as she was convinced he didn't understand the words, she said, "Am I taking the furniture away? Won't it seem like we're showing that we've given up all hope of improvement and we're abandoning him to cope for himself? I think it'd be best to leave the room exactly the way it was so that when Gregor comes back to us again, he'll find everything unchanged and he'll be able to forget the time between all the easier." Having heard these words from his mother made Gregor realize that the lack of any direct human communication, along with the monotonous life led by the family during these 2 months, must have made him confused. He could think of no other way of explaining to himself why he'd seriously wanted his room emptied out. Had he really wanted to transform his room into a cave, a warm room fitted out with nice furniture that he'd inherited? That would have let him crawl around unimpeded in any direction, but it would have also let him quickly forget his past when he had still been human. He'd come very close to forgetting, and it had only been the voice of his mother, unheard for so long, that had shaken him out of it. Nothing should be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not do without the good influence the furniture had on his condition. And even if the furniture made it difficult for him to crawl around mindlessly, that was not a loss, but a great advantage. All right. So we're going to do our final question, or if you haven't been pausing, this is going to be, where you can start all the questions. So our last question is, what is happening to Gregor's state of mind, and what makes you say that? So when you're ready, you can go ahead and start answering questions.